Hello, my name is Robert Dean Steele, and I'm going to take my glasses off because I don't need them for this particular discussion. Let me just do a couple of things here just to kind of get ourselves in the right frame of mind. And it's really exciting to be with you this afternoon. And we're going to be talking about current events. Now, there's been so much happening in 2024. And here we are, the second last day of 2024. Did you know that when I was a young lad, every year Casey Kasem would illustrate and also play the top 100 songs of that particular year? And I would listen to the radio basically all day. And usually it was right around midnight that you would hear what the number one song was for the year. And it was all based on the Billboard charts. Well, every year people kind of reflect on what has happened in the last year. Well, there's been lots of events that have been happening. And I'm going to look at all these events in the light of eternity and also, as well, in the light of what the Bible has to say concerning these matters. So we'll talk about them and then we'll kind of look at an application that we can look at as we head into 2025. Now, remember, we measure time in seconds, sometimes nanoseconds. We look at time in minutes and hours and days, and then weeks and months and years. Now, really, I had a conversation with someone yesterday, and I was talking with them about Christmas and how that Christmas, for some people, is very, very much a time of celebration. She said to me, Christmas was just like any other day. And I thought to myself, very interesting. There are people who basically just look at one day at the next. And some of the hoopla that we have going into, for example, a brand new year is more what we would call anticipation. And maybe for us psychologically, it is closing a certain period of time. You know, the Bible does tell us that the mercies of God are new every morning. Great is his faithfulness. So we do know one thing, that God is going to be faithful every single day. And we also know that he's going to be with us every single day. But when we look back at the past year, there have been some major events worldwide and also as well internationally and domestically that we can kind of look at and say, okay, let's examine them. For example, when we went into 2024, there were two major wars that were fighting and happening in both the Middle East and as well the in Russia and Ukraine. Now, both of them were incredibly bloody conflicts. In fact, some people have called the war in Ukraine nothing but a human meat grinder. And of course, over the last year, we saw hundreds of thousands of lives lost in that particular war. And it was, of course, it all started because the nation of Ukraine. Now, maybe what we need to go do is go back just a little bit. Now, depending on which side of the table you find yourself in, you'll find a reason why Russia did what Russia did, and also Ukraine doing what it did. Now, again, depending on who you are talking to and listening to, Russia, for example, has always considered Ukraine as part of its territory. Way back in 1797, they basically invaded Ukraine and annexed Ukraine. It was only back when the Iron Curtain actually fell that Russia relinquished control of Ukraine and it became its own independent state. And it wanted and still desires to have freedom. But as far as the Russian mentality is, Ukraine has always been part of Mother Russia. It's also interesting that just a couple of days ago, I read that one of the ports that is in Crimea, and the reason why that Russia felt they needed to, of course, invade is they did not want to lose their seaport that is open all year round on the Black Sea. And so they felt that that was something they needed to do and keep, because they had that seaport since basically for 1797 when they annexed Ukraine. And so, in the mindset of the Russians, listen, the Ukraine belongs to us. Now, if you follow certain thoughts, way back in 1989, when the Iron Curtain fell, um, Russia and the United States and the European Union had some negotiating. They started talking back and forth. And what happened was they said, United States says, we will not, and NATO will not go any further east if you allow the Ukrainians to, of course, have their own country. There was an agreement with Gorbachev, later Yeltsin, about that fact. And so, also as well, they said Ukraine has to remain neutral. Well, and they also said, no, NATO can't go anywhere east. Well, that's not exactly what happened. Of course, very shortly after that, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania became NATO countries. And when the Iron Curtain fell, there were 16 NATO countries. Now it's approaching 30 NATO countries. And several of those countries are right on the border of Russia. Now, Russia, of course, also as well signed some intercontinental ballistic missile treaties with the United States. In 2002, the United States pulled out of one of those treaties. And then during the mid teens of 2000s, they also pulled out of another treaty that they had made with, of course, Russia. Both of these particular treaties were signed by previous Russian leaders. And Mr. Putin began to feel a little bit on the, he was feeling like he was being crowded. But NATO kept on, of course, uh, expanding to the east, where now they are right up against the Russian border. Poland is a NATO country. They said that Poland would never be a NATO country. Now it is a NATO country. Latvia, Estonia, as well as Lithuania, and then just recently, Finland became a NATO country, and they both Sweden and Finland were neutral countries until the beginning of the Ukrainian war. Then they were offered membership in NATO, and of course, they became NATO countries. So here you have this former empire of the Soviet Union, and then, of course, Russia, now being squeezed in by all sides by, of course, NATO countries and by the United States, who is the main backer of NATO and the European Union. So you have this conflict that's going on and this mentality that goes on with expansionism. Now, in recent days, of course, they had, United States had 4 years of Mr. Biden. And Mr. Biden, even though he was considered a moderate, he, of course, stood behind NATO. Now, it's going to be interesting to see what happens next year. This is going to be a very interesting year, 2025, because the major event of 2025 was the rejection of the Biden Kamala Harris, should say, tandem for presidency. Because remember, Kamala Harris, she ran for presidency. She wasn't nominated by the voters, the Democratic voters. She was basically parachuted in because Biden showed that he was basically losing it as far as the American public was concerned. He stepped down, and Kamala Harris, under the leadership of the Democratic Party, she ran for president. And that all happened back in, of course, July. And that began a major shift because, first of all, many people didn't believe that Mr. Donald Trump had, of course, the backing of so many American people. But you see, when you find yourself in an economic tailspin, you know what happens? People vote according to their wallets. They don't vote necessarily according to their political or philosophical leanings. Some people do, but the majority of people want to know, okay, what can you do to bring down inflation? What can you do to make more money in my pocket and bring more money in my pocket? I got to feed my family. I got to, take care of the gas and the electricity. I got to, put gas in my tank. I got to pay the rent. I got to pay the mortgage. And these prices have just skyrocketed. Also, as well, during the presidency and also the leadership of my own country, the Liberal Party, there was a pandemic where people were basically locked down and people wanted to get out. And when they finally did get out, there was this time period where actually the economy had shrunk under the previous administrations. And then what happened was it exploded. Then all of a sudden, you had, during the pandemic, you had interest rates at record low levels. And then what happened was when everything began to expand, well, inflation took off. And in some areas, up to 10%. Well, immediately the central bank said, you know what we got to do? We got to raise interest rates. And in my country, for example, they raised it 475 points. In the United States, they did it even more. And this caused the economy to come to a crashing halt. But the prices had already increased, but people's wages did not increase. And I'm not an economics, but you see, I've been around long enough to see what happens. I have seen this happen over and over again. We saw it happen in the 1970s. We saw it happen in the early 80s. We saw it in the early 90s. There were what we would call recession, and then you would have expansion, and it went back and forth. And that's the way it basically operates. And also, as well, when a government gets too big, gets too bloated, then what happens is, of course, in my country, for example, this fall, most of the jobs that were created in Canada were what we would call civil servant or public wages or public service type of jobs. And that was the main driver. And so you have this bloated type of administration and bureaucracy. And that cuts into, of course, the economics of any government. And then you find out that they start borrowing ridiculous amounts of money. Now, that's what happened in both Canada and United States. And it affected the supply chains. It affected the price of gas and the price of oil and the price of energy and the price of food. And then in Canada, we had some economic policies that were right out in left field, literally, where they have a carbon tax. And it started off at $25, then it went to $50, went up to $65. And in this April, it's supposed to go up to, I think, $80 or $100. Well, that affects, of course, your bottom line. I was chatting with my congregation on Sunday and I said, check your fuel bill. check your energy bill, and you will find it broken up in three different ways. Number one, you will have the actual consumption of the energy that you have, consumed. Then you have all the rate riders, all the added on fees that they put in, like transportation fees and transmission fees, and all those extra fees that they put on. And you'll find out that your fees are just as much as your consumption. Then in my country, what you have is a third column, and that's the carbon tax. And the carbon tax is as high as the rate riders and as high as also the consumption. So we're being taxed right to the roof in my country. And so these are, of course, very strong indicators and motivators for people to say, this government doesn't understand. It is not in tune with where we are. So, in, of course, 2024, in November, the people of United States made a decision, and that decision was they don't like the way their country is going. And of course, there were other factors, sociological factors, cultural factors, and educational factors, and also is why biological factors that were basically dominating the narrative both in the social media and in the media sphere. And so the Democratic Party were saying, we're going to go this way. And the Republicans said, no, we want to go this way. And the majority of the people were saying, you know what? We want some common sense. So they voted in Mr. Trump. And Mr. Trump, of course, his big claim to fame was, well, the economy was really good and humming. Well, I was the president and there wasn't any major wars. So he was touting that particular shtick and that particular appeal. And people were tired of wars. They're tired of hearing about Ukraine. They're tired about what's going on in the Middle East. They're tired of all the different protests that are going on behalf of the Palestinians. They're tired of the violence. They're tired of the encampments. They're tired of the homelessness. And so you have someone who comes on and says, I am going to do something about that. I'm going to put a bunch of presidential orders in, and I'm going to make everything, common sense. That's what is being offered, for example, by Pierre Poilievre in my country of Canada. He's just simply saying, let's bring it home. Let's have some common sense again. He says, we can work this out. Now, of course, coming into the new year is going to be very, very interesting economically. It's going to be very different socially, politically, educationally. It's going to be all these different current events. Now, also, as well, in 2024, we saw a major shift in what we would call the Middle East. And that was something that was also not expected. You see, back in October 7th of 2023, the Hamas, they basically broke out of Gaza and they caused a massacre of about 1,200 people. And what happened was it triggered the response between, of course, Israel and Hamas. Israel instantaneously began to bomb and began to send its armies into Gaza. In the north, however, you had during 2023 and 2024 the Hezbollah, who they say had about 50,000 fighters. They had about 200,000 rockets, and they were shooting rockets at Israel, the northern territories in the northern part of Israel, where 60,000 Israelis had to flee from their homes and live in shelters and in basic accommodations, and they weren't able to go home. And this battle went on until October. Finally, Israel said, we've had enough. During the month, or during the parts of 2024, Israel was actually fighting wars on 7 fronts, 7 different fronts. You had Syria, you had Iraq, you had Lebanon, you had Yemen, you had, Gaza, and you also had, Iran attacking as well. So they were being attacked on seven different fronts. So they decided that they needed to decisively deal with each one of these particular problems. And so they increased their attack on, of course, Gaza. And according to, of course, the Hamas leadership, and also the Palestinian, or the Gazan world records, they say that 45,000 people have died under the attack of Israel. And then what happened was Israel decided, we've got to end this particular attack on us from the north. Then they began to bomb Lebanon. They began to eliminate the leaders of Hamas. They eliminated the leaders of Hezbollah, and they basically bombed Hezbollah back into the Stone Age. And Hezbollah became, in the month of November, they made a ceasefire, something that was unprecedented with Israel. They said, we're not going to do this anymore. We're going to go back to the Litani River. We're going to go back to the original 2006 agreement. And basically, they became a former shadow of themselves. Now, I'm not saying for a single moment that they are eliminated, but of course, they're not the fighting force that they were. Israel then could, of course, work on Gaza. And right now, they have one other group that they've got to deal with, and that's the Houthis, who are in Yemen. And they, of course, have been supplied by Iran. Now, what was also unprecedented was, of course, there were two direct confrontations, one in April and one in October, from Iran. That had never happened before. And Israel responded. And when Israel responded, they used their F 35 jets. There was about 80 of them that went into Iran and bombed, of course, different military installations and different places. And they also directly attacked Iran's ability to, of course, produce uranium and all the components that could build a bomb, because Iran had also began their nuclear enrichment. Okay. Now, one of the events that happened in Iran, of course, was the presidency. The president was elected, was a moderate. Now, of course, this whole conflict in the country of Lebanon definitely left him in a very precarious position. And but with the elimination of Nasrallah and Hananiah and also Sinwar, these were all leaders of Hamas and as well Hezbollah. And they also took care of military leaders and political leaders. Israel was very, very busy. And the one thing that they made very clear is that they say, we know where you are and we know how to get to you. And they followed through with what they said, which has put a bit of a fear into the enemies of Israel. They even showed that they could go into Tehran and eliminate leadership of course, Hamas in Tehran. So this has been all going on in the Middle East. And Israel has also, as well, and this is the big one. The big one, of course, is the end of the reign of the Assad family in Syria. You see, what was happening was this: there were two main backers in Syria. The first one was, of course, the Russians. They had basically got involved in 214 right up to, basically 2024. For 10 years, the Russians were involved. And the reason why they were involved is because there wasn't strong leadership in, of course, America. And so when they got involved with the Middle East conflict, they established bases in the nation of Syria, and they were backing the Syrian army. Okay. The second influence, of course, was Iran. Syria was a pipeline to arms and armaments into, of course, Lebanon and, of course, Hezbollah. So what happened was simply this. Russia, of course, was involved in a meat grinder war in Europe, where they've lost close to 1 million casualties. Hundreds of thousands of people have lost their lives on both sides. It has not been easy for the Ukrainians or for the Russians. And the Russians have been also bringing in, of course, North Korean troops. They've also been using foreign troops, mercenaries into the war. Also, as well, Russia has been dealing with sanctions from the West and expansion of NATO. The one thing that has never happened before happened just this month. You say, what is that? The very first time America actually used its armament against Russia. They allowed the Ukrainians to use Russian or American made armaments, something they'd never used before, to use against Russia. And so that's something that has escalated the situation as well. Now, of course, you have Syria falling because Russia was not there to, of course, back them up. Secondly, the Iranians had suffered some major defeats and economic defeats and at the hands of both Israel and the West. So basically, they couldn't help them anymore. And so what happened was Assad, way at the end of November 29th, he actually went into Moscow and he said, we need your help. And they said, we can't help you. We can't do anything for you. He went over to Iran, and Iran says, we're too busy. We can't help you either. His two allies that had propped him up, and also as well, during the Syrian war, the fighting force that worked alongside of him was, of course, Hezbollah. At one time, there was somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 Hezbollah troops fighting against the rebels that were in, of course, Syria. And so what happened was when all of those forces gone, Hezbollah was now a shadow of its former self. Russia was involved in a major war in Europe. And Iran, of course, was under sanctions and also had been humiliated by Israel. He had no place to go. So, what does he do? And this is a report that came from both CNN and Reuters. And they said he flew back into, of course, into Damascus, and his leadership said, what happened? He says, Russia's got my back. Iran's got my back. Basically, he lied to his leadership team. Meanwhile, he had left his wife up in Moscow using the excuse that she was getting medical treatment. And so he gathers his affairs together. And then what does he do? He basically charters a plane from Damascus airport heading over to, of course, the Soviet or the Russian base in where it was. And he jumps on an airplane and heads up to Moscow and basically leaves the Syrian leadership and also, as well, the Syrian forces to basically fend for themselves. Well, we know what happened in a very short period of time. The rebels not only took Aleppo, they took Qum, they took Damascus, and now there is a new leadership that is happening in the country of Syria. I was reading this morning about the Jewish community in Syria. Did you know that at the beginning of 1948, that there were 100,000 Jews in Syria? And then as time progressed, more and more either emigrated into the country of Israel or they emigrated over to United States. Now, it's interesting that under the Assad government, the Jewish community, right up to 2014, numbered about 10,000 people. But when the war actually started, most of the Jewish community fled the country along with millions of other Syrians and basically found themselves in countries around the world. Now they say that there's only 9 Jews left back in the country of Syria. They were talking today to the what they would call the top man in the Jewish community there, and he said, "Yeah, there's only about 9 or 10 of us left that we are aware of in the country." So what's happened is you have seen a large Jewish community that we used to be in Syria, now down to basically less than 10 people. And they asked the question, are you going to stay in Syria? He says, yes, I'm going to stay in Syria because my identity is Jewish. But he says, I have lived all my life in, of course, Syria. And they also interviewed an 88-year-old lady who was living in the same community. And she said, yeah, I'm going to stay. She says, because I believe that there may be a new future for Syria. So that's where they're kind of going. So these are all events that, of course, are very, very, striking. And these are some of the things that have happened in 2024. When you look at, the international situation, when I look at my nation of Canada, it certainly has been an interesting year. When our prime minister started off, 2024, he was semi, popular. He was still in around the 25%. Well, as time progressed, he became and things became more expensive. The carbon tax came in and they borrowed more money. Here's a perfect example. They said in back in March, we're not going to have a deficit over $40 billion. Now, folks, Canada's deficit sits at $1.4 trillion. Now you say that's a lot of money, especially when you look at the fact that there's only 41 million people in Canada. Now that pales in comparison to the debt that United States is dealing with. United States has a $37 trillion debt. And when they were negotiating the new budget, the new we're going to spend this much money. Mr. Trump and Mr. Musk said to the senators that were there, they said, listen, we want you to raise the debt ceiling. And the reason why is that we can borrow more money. It was interesting that even Republican leadership decided that they were not going to do that. They decided that they weren't going to raise the debt ceiling because they didn't want to put any more strain on the budgets and on the American economy. And so, yeah, and you say, well, why would Mr. Trump agree with that? You have to understand something. Most of his money that he spent and earned was someone else's money. Someone else's footed the bill. And so when he lost money, so did also the banks. He wasn't what we would call the best businessman. He knew how to get money and he knew how to use money and he knew how to make money using someone else's money. And that is, of course, the essence of good entrepreneurship. When you listen to entrepreneurs, they'll always tell you, don't use your own money. Use somebody else's money. Get somebody else to invest and believe what you are doing. And in that way, you are not the one losing money. Well, Mr. Trump, of course, knows that. And so when he came to the table and asked, of course, the senators to, of course, approve the plan, he says, we need to have more money. We got to up the ante when it comes to the debt ceiling, so that we can run this country a little bit more efficient. It's okay that we're running in the red. It's okay that we're borrowing trillions of dollars. It doesn't matter. What matters is we got to keep the economy going. We got to keep, government going. And it was interesting. This is the difference between current leadership and past leadership. I was listening to Ronald Reagan a couple of days ago, and Ronald Reagan was a person who said, listen, the reason, and it was during a debate that he was having actually with Jimmy Carter. Now, Jimmy Carter, as you're well aware of, passed away on Sunday or yesterday. And so, but in this debate, Mr. Reagan was saying this. He said, listen, the problem with what we're feeling with right now, he was talking about the inflation of the 1970s. He says, the problem we're having right now is when government becomes more important than people. He says, when government starts interfering and saying to the people, we know what's best for you, instead of the people saying to the government, we know what's best for you. And when people say to the government, listen, you can't keep doing what you are doing, and government ignores it, he says, that's we're doing at our peril. Well, that's what's happening today. Leadership today, when they are in leadership, politicians, and I can give you a perfect example in the city in which I used to live. We had a bunch of politicians that were elected in 2021, the city of Edmonton. And during that time, they have basically hit the people of Edmonton with about 25 to 27% increase in taxes. In taxes. Last year, it was almost 10%. This year, it's 8.1%. In 2 years, they had slapped on 17% in 2 years. And they're saying we need to do this for the infrastructure and for the projects that we're involved in. The problem is they have a spending problem. The people of Edmonton have a problem that they can't pay for all of these things. And it's amazing how that people can get and lose perspective concerning that. Ronald Reagan simply said, you have inflation as soon as government starts borrowing money and government starts telling you what you need and what they will give you. And they will peddle that bunch of stuff until you actually believe that is what you need. And so that's what happens. In my country of Canada, we've been running deficits for several years. Now, the interesting fact was, and this is the Liberal government before Mr. Trudeau took over, the Liberal government was led by John Chrétien and Paul Martin. Now, Paul Martin was an economist, and during the years of Mr. Chrétien and Mr. Martin, they actually ran surpluses. That's right, they actually run surpluses. But then what happened was this, that when the Liberal Party got Mr. Trudeau, and Mr. Trudeau, of course, is living on the coattails of his dad's name, and he is not an economist. Okay, he doesn't know how to run a government, and the Liberal Party has basically taken on his brand and his ideas. And so his idea was simply this: you know what? If we don't have enough money to run the economy, we'll just simply borrow it. And then, of course, when the pandemic came along, he said, everyone was saying, what is the government going to do? Because they were the ones that were shutting things down. So Mr. Trudeau said, no problem at all. We'll just borrow a bunch of money. And in the pandemic, he borrowed almost $500 billion. Now, folks, that comes back to bite us where it shouldn't be bitten. Anyway, that's what happened in my country of Canada. And as the economy began to worsen, so did Mr. Trudeau's approval rating. He had a finance minister who back in March said, we're not going to go over the $40 billion situation that we find ourselves in. Well, Mr. Trudeau came along and back in the month of December basically said, you know what? We're going to, and this is an interesting little side if you happen to be Canadian. You know that back in September, Mr. Jagmeet Singh, he basically what he did was he tore up this supply agreement. When the Trudeau government came into power, Mr. Jagmeet Singh said to, and the NDP said, we're going to stand behind you as long as you do what we want you to do. Now, Mr. Trudeau, because he is similar in philosophy with the NDP, said, "Yeah, we can work that out. That can happen." And so, they did several programs that were, one was a kind of a pharmacare program for dentists, and also as well they did other things as well. And so the NDP said, we're going to do that. But then something happened over the summer in Canada, and that was that there was going to be a rail strike. Now, the NDP and Jagmeet Singh, their main support is union support. So as soon as the Liberal government ordered the railway workers back to work and also the dock workers back to work, then of course he said, we can't support this government anymore. So then the Bloc Québécois, which is, of course, a separatist party in Quebec, that is the unique thing about Canadian politics, is the fact that we have two official languages and we have basically 9 provinces and 3 territories that are mainly English speaking, right? And then we have Quebec, which is of course, a Quebec or a French speaking province. And it's also had this idea back in the 1970s. There was a group called the Parti Québécois, and they became um, actually leadership in the province of Quebec. They were separatists, and the Bloc is a separatist party. And they decided that they were going to go nationally. So we have a bunch of party Bloc Québécois leadership in Ottawa, who are basically saying we will always represent Quebec, because Quebec, in the mindset of the Bloc and the mindset of the Parti Québécois, is we are separatists and we don't really want to be part of Canada, but we also know that the political system, we need to represent Quebec. So back in the month of October, the Bloc said, listen, if you will do what you did for the seniors who are over the age of 75 and give those under the age of 75 down to 65, if you will give them the same 10% amount of money, then what will happen is we will keep the government going. Well, the government said, we can't do that. That's going to cost us $3.5 billion. So we're not going to give that support to seniors right across Canada because that's too much money. And the Bloc said, wait a minute. It doesn't make sense. Now, the Bloc, of course, was saying we're doing it for Quebec seniors, because you have to understand something. During the 1970s, most of the people that were supporting the Bloc and also the Parti Québécois, which is the separatists, they were young. They were in their 20s and 30s. But now we're talking decades later. We're talking 50 years later. So most of the Bloc support happens to be seniors. And so that just made a natural progression. They were protecting their political base. And when the Trudeau government decided we're not going to do that, you know what happened? The Bloc says, we're going to do everything to bring you down. That's what they said. And Mr. Jagmeet Singh stood behind them right until, of course, Christmas time, when he said, no more of this. I'm going to bring them down after the break. Now, also, what happened was at the 1st of December, Mr. Trudeau decided, you know what we're going to do? We're going to try and buy your votes. So what did he say? He said, you know what? We're going to have a GST holiday. That means, like a sales tax, we have a federal sales tax that came in the '80s under the leadership of Brian Mulroney. And so it started off as a 7% tax. Now it's a 5% tax. So he said, we're going to have a GST holiday. And by the way, we're going to send everybody in Canada, who qualifies a $250 check. So when they did the actual tabulation, it was almost $7 billion. So he turned down a proposal for the seniors for $3.5 billion and then said, you know what? We're going to give all the Canadians a $7 billion bonanza. Now, we don't have $7 billion to just throw around, but he came into conflict with his finance minister, who happened to be Chrystia Freeland. And so basically what happened was, when it was they had this jockeying going around in the back deal. Everybody knew that this was going on. Everybody in Ottawa knew what was going on. Everybody in the country knew what was going on. So it wasn't a surprise that on the day of the economic statement, now get this, got to back up for just a minute. On the Friday, he walks across the floor, that being our prime minister, walks across the floor and then says to Chrystia Freeland, you know what? I want you to step down as finance minister. I'll give you another promotion, another portfolio. Basically, she is the deputy prime minister and the finance minister. It is a major demotion. She knew that she was no longer in the good books, and yet she was a loyal supporter to him. So, you know what? She decides to bail. She decides to write a letter and puts it on X, basically saying and airing out the laundry, the dirty laundry of the pardon. And then all of a sudden, you have to understand, back in September, there was a small group of MPs, that Liberal MPs, who said, maybe it's time for you to go, because the simple fact is, if we're going to find ourselves, basically nothing left of us. That's what's going to happen if you stay in this leadership. And then Chrystia Freeland, of course, resigns. And then they have this caucus meeting where as many as 50 of the Liberal MPs say, listen, Prime Minister, you've got to go. You've got to go. And he said, well, I'll think about it over, of course, the Christmas holidays. Now, the Christmas holidays happens to be 6 weeks long as far as Parliament's concerned. So for the next 6 weeks, basically, Canada is at a standstill. That's where we are right now. So going into 2025 is going to be very, very interesting politically. Now, how does that affect us? It affects us in every way possible. You know what? You're going to feel it economically. You're going to feel it politically. You're going to feel it culturally. You're going to feel it educationally. Things are shifting. Things are changing. Some to the good, some not to the good. For example, what's going to be good out of this? Well, first of all, some of the policies that have been promoted by the left, and I just want to give you a little thought here. The Bible says the wise always go to the right and the fools go to the left. And I'll just leave it at that. Okay. Now, what that means is that some of the policies that have been facing us educationally, politically, socially, economically are going to change. Okay. We're not exactly sure what that means. We know that when Mr. Trump comes into power, there is going to be what I'm going to call an earthquake type of shape. Okay. Um, he is a volatile individual. Okay. And he's a very assertive individual. And so he has already made his intentions known when it comes to the countries around him and how he is going to deal with them. Now, they may be what we would call a business tactic, because basically what you do is you threaten somebody with something and then you back off when you figure you've got them exactly where you want them. So that's what's happening with Mr. Trump. And we need to recognize that he has a certain mode of operation. And there's enough people in the United States who believe that the direction he's going is right, that over the next 4 years, he's going to have a lot of support. For those in the international community, well, it means that it's going to be a very interesting ride over the next few years. You can either like him or you don't like him. The simple fact is, he is a reality in our world today. And he is the president of the number one economy in the world. Okay. And he has already said what he's going to do with certain countries and in certain situations. Maybe it's a little bravado, maybe it's not. I guess we'll find that out. In my country of Canada, it should be very interesting when our prime minister comes back and what he does. We may be having a spring election. We might have a summer election. We will for sure have a fall election. And that is going to definitely affect the politics, the economics, the social structure of Canada as well, because Canada has been far leaning to the left in recent time period. Now, we're probably going to swing back because Canada does that. We do that every 10 years. We give a prime minister and his government 2 terms, and then we say, can't stand you anymore, so they punt him. That's what happens in Canada. And it sounds like it happens in the United States as well. I mean, yes, Mr. Biden was a one-term president, but they did have actually 12 years of Democratic rule with Mr. Obama, and also as well and then they had Mr. Trump, and then they had Mr. Biden. So they've traded off a little bit here and there. In the light of everything that we see, what do we do? Well, if you happen to be a Christian, you know that when there is instability all around us, there is one stability, and that is the Lord. And that is where we have to go. We have to understand something politically, economically, socially, culturally, educationally. We're not on the same page with this world. Okay. Sometimes they flow in the direction that we want them to go, but our citizenship is not here. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be involved in the affairs of people. We should be. We are the restraining and enlightening force. But as well, we need to recognize that this world is not our home. This is not as good as it gets. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't, bloom where we're planted. I'll give you an example of that. Daniel was taken from his home in Jerusalem and Judah. He was transported over to Babylon, and he was invited to be part of the Babylonian bureaucracy. He took the invitation. Well, it was actually a forced invitation, but he began to work within the system of the Babylonian bureaucracy and the culture and everything like that. He never gave up his integrity. He never gave up his religious identity. He never gave up his honesty. He never gave up a single thing. He was a follower of the Lord all the way through. And yet he was able to navigate and successfully navigate the world in which he lived, where he became not only a confidant of Nebuchadnezzar, but later on became a confidant of Darius and Cyrus of the Persian Empire. He was a man who was able to navigate 2 major empires and succeed. So it is possible to do that without losing one single shred of integrity or one single shred of identity as a child of God. We can do that, but it takes real wisdom. And Daniel showed that wisdom when he first was confronted with a diet choice. He saw the food from the king's table, and he knew that the food from the king's table had been offered to idols. And so he very wisely and very smartly and very cleverly approached the a person, the attendant who was in charge. And he said, listen, he says, we're really struggling with this king's food. He says, well, you got to eat it because otherwise it's my head, not yours as well. He said, listen, why don't you test us out for 10 days? Let us eat fruits and vegetables only and drink water and not the wine that is offered. And if you find that we are not in better shape, wiser, or in better condition, then we will return to the king's table. So he said, yes. So he tested them out after 10 days of that particular diet, and they were looking healthier. They were looking smarter. They had mental alertness. And so they did not have to follow the diet of the king's table, which was a very wise decision. And you see him navigating through that particular system, and we can do the same. We need to recognize that you can be every bit of a Christian that you want to be when you are wise as serpent and as harmless as doves. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't come into conflict from time to time with, of course, the system where we find ourselves. I was listening yesterday to a pastor who was talking about his particular experience in the country of Iran. He was there at the invitation of some Christians in the country. He was doing some, ministry, and they found him out, that being the Iranian officials. He ended up being, of course, detained, tortured, and imprisoned for 9 weeks. Finally, after 9 weeks, he was released. Now, the thing that really caught him was as he was sitting there in the cell, the Holy Spirit said to him, "You know what? You're going to be here for 9 weeks." He said, "Lord, I don't want to be here for 9 weeks." Well, he ended up there 9 weeks. And in fact, to the very moment that he was incarcerated, the Lord is so good. But the thing that he learned was he could actually thrive in the place where he was. He said his prayer life absolutely mushroomed. His love for God and his love for worship actually deepened in that place. We know from the Apostle Paul, his prison letters are not letters of defeat, but they're letters of victory. We can bloom where we're planted. The most important thing is we stay on track. We know that the world around us is about to get very interesting. And we know that because we are in this world, that doesn't mean we have to be of this world. It means that we need to pray. Pray for those in authority over us. That's what Paul said. He said, pray for those in authority over you, that you can live quiet and peaceful lives in godliness and righteousness. That's why we need to do it. It was Pat Boone in the cantata, If My People. He said, God does not expect the unrighteous to pray. He's pleasantly surprised when they do. But he says simply this: he does hold God's people accountable. So, what should you and I do? We should humble ourselves. We should pray. We should seek your face and turn from our wicked ways, because the Lord made a promise. He'll hear from heaven, he'll forgive our sins, and he will heal our land. The only reason why wickedness has not overtaken our world yet is because you and I are still here. Paul told us that the Holy Spirit is the restrainer of evil in this world. And where does the Holy Spirit live? Inside of us. So you and I are actually the ones that hold back the forces of darkness in our community. If we weren't there, darkness would take over. Evil would reign supreme. But because we're there, it's not going to happen. So you and I, we need to pray. And we need to be very discerning over what is going on in the world around us. Let us today be beacons of righteousness and light. Let us be salt. Let us flavor, and let us also preserve that which is good. Remember, righteousness exalts a nation. Sin is a reproach to any plan. We are going to see some major changes in 2025. When Mr. Trump takes hold of the American presidency, there is going to be some major changes. Things that were happening, recently will change dramatically. The same is going to happen in Canada when this prime minister decides to either resign or, fight through. There's going to be a change because Canadians want a change, just like the Americans wanted a change. And it could be very dramatic. What we need to do is we need to be the stability, we need to be the reliability, we need to be the constancy, we need to not lose our heads. One person put it this way: when everyone else is losing their heads and not knowing what's going on, don't you lose yours. And also, as well, keep your eyes on the prize. What's the prize? The high calling of the Lord in our lives. We're to go into our world and bring the gospel, the good news. We're to, of course, disciple people and teach people about righteousness. And we're supposed to love them. And these are wonderful qualities that you and I should be involved in. So these are my thoughts today on our current events. Now, if you like what you're hearing, I always encourage you to press the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel. My name is Robert Dean Steele. Thank you so much for being with me today. And thank you for the opportunity of sharing these few thoughts with you today.